Rightio. Rightio.
Hello.
Oh, yes. Hello, hello. There we go. Sir, welcome back. And as to what has been a very last minute organization from me, I remember last time you and I coordinated, we're like, when are you available next? And today was the day. And last night I'm like, wait, it's today for you. Well, no, it's...
I'd completely forgotten as well, so...
Okay, well, fair enough. It works out at the end,
I forget everything. Unless it's in my calendar, it's gone, you know?
Yeah,
the
that's
split
true.
second the conversation changes.
The only reason I got this and remembered was because I had in my calendar like an all-day event for today that it's Munchables content. And I was like, wait, what is that? Turns out that was actually my content in the end. And so we got there in the end. Thank you again for joining me. Like, yeah, a giga last minute. It's
no problem.
11 p.m. there for you. No. You don't have to say thank you. I say thank you to you.
It's too late. I already said it. What are you going to do now?
I don't know.
There's no going back.
We're in too deep. I might end the stream, to be honest. I might just
you know, it's been a great stream. It's been a great conversation. Thanks everyone for tuning in.
No worries. Thanks, guys. Appreciate it. Of course, I had to get you back because remember last time you and I had a big chat. We went over and what was going to be one episode ends up turning into two because, you know, you talked a lot about your history and I didn't realize your history was that in depth. If other people haven't seen the first part, Munchables in the first part of this casting chamber talked all about like his road, which was a 7-8 year stint in the end, I think. Like super long.
Yeah. I've been doing it for 8 years and it took a long time to get to doing the good stuff. I'm not gonna lie, a lot longer than I had bargained for, but we made it.
We did. I mean, you did, and we got here to the second part as well. So after talking about your experience, I mean, I had to get you back today because talking about the mechanics as well is something that I think is really important in this series and something that people who are trying to learn the craft can take away quite easily. So going into today, I want to ask you play-by-play specific questions. We, of course, are starting the series on the play-by-play side of bracket, which for anyone who doesn't know or might be starting out, is the hype side, is the play calling, and this is something that you can help me with as well. Because starting off, like the biggest question I want to ask you to open things up to get us into it is how you actually define your role. Like I want you to give me the lowdown, the way you think about it in your head when you're broadcasting, when you're thinking about your role in conjunction with your color or your trio, is how you define your role as a play-by-play and like what your job actually is.
Sure. So I think the best word that I've heard used to describe a play-by-play that's the most like kind of all-encompassing is storyteller, right? Because ultimately all casters are fundamentally storytellers. We're telling the stories of the players and of the teams and of the league and etc. But for play-by-play specifically, like every aspect of what you do as a play-by-play is finding interesting ways to tell the stories of the players and finding ways to get the audience engaged. So that includes, shouting and getting hype during the big moments, because ultimately, as a commentator, your job is not just to say what is happening on the screen, but to try and add to that and try and, anyone that doesn't, anyone that's not aware that this is a huge moment happening on the screen, it's your job to make sure that they know that this is a huge moment happening on the screen, right? But a huge part of that I think a lot of people don't often realize or acknowledge is that those huge moments, I would say 90% of the time, require context, right? League of Legends is the game of context. A big moment only matters if you know the context of the series and of what's happened in the game so far. Is this guy fed? Are they behind? Et cetera, et cetera. So you're building the story of the game the entire time. And so for me, the fundamental role in play-by-play is building those stories so that then when it comes to the biggest moments, there is a story to lean into, and that's kind of the climax to the story. That's the crescendo that you've been building towards. So for me, the biggest part of the art is building that story to be able to set up for the final finish.
Yeah, and you also talked about the play happening on the screen as well. I think that's something that needs to be highlighted. Is like, you know, being aware of your surroundings and being able to put that story. It's something that's a little bit deep, but I want to bring in as to what you've been talking to me about recently with a lot of, you know, our VOD reviews that you've done for my side, where you talked about injecting that story into the play, injecting that story in parts where it makes sense as well, getting that flow going. I think something really hard for people to understand, where you can do too much of it, right? You can be too much of a storyteller as a play-by-play. I think that is a thing. I know that there have been fans in the past of major regions who said, like, oh, there's way too much storytelling in this region, or there's no focusing on the game. You can be too much one side, right? Like, you can't be all storyteller.
For sure, yeah. Like, I mean, obviously, we've all seen the memes on Reddit about LEC's narratives, right? I don't think that they're unaware of the Reddit situation, right?
Yeah.
But, like, I mean, for me, maybe I'm just an idiot because I do this as a job. I love that shit. I gobble that shit up all day long. But I totally can see where the audience are coming from at times. I think it's much less about whether or not you're telling a story and much more about how you go into, like, how you transition into that story.
Yeah.
Because sometimes it feels a little bit shoehorned in, you know. Sometimes it's like, yeah, we're talking about the bot lane matchup. By the way, did you know this mid laner, blah, 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 blah. It's like kind of a really harsh transition.
Yeah.
So it can be a little bit painful at times like that. But I think, you know, outside of just, you know, telling stories, I feel like this is a very pretentious answer to your question, honestly.
But it's a good baseline.
The simple side. Yeah. I would say that is the backbone of everything that we do, but the actual bare bones of it, of like what actually is like obviously commentating team fights. So when it gets action packed, speaking fast and speaking loud and making it exciting, and popping off when the players pop off. It's also kind of sort of playing a pseudo host role in the conversation a lot of the time. Like, if you're in a very slow game, there's a lot of downtime. It's ultimately the play-by-play's responsibility to keep that conversation flowing, bring up new topics, like segue into things that you and your color had prepped to talk about during the series. These kinds of things ultimately fall into the host position. Not that color casters can't segue the conversation or anything like that themselves as well, but generally speaking, the responsibility lies with the play-by-play. And then on top of that as well, generally speaking, it will be the play-by-plays, not really responsibility, but usually it's play-by-plays that will bring up statistics, right? Because the way that you want to, generally in my experience, the way you want to approach statistics is often for the play-by-play to kind of set up the narrative point that you're trying to put across with these statistics, which I'll be the first to admit in esports is often ham-fisted, but... So I'll give you an example. It's going to be easier to give an example than try and explain what I'm saying. So, like, I'll say, like, oh, well, this player has incredibly high CSD at 15 because he's a lane dominant player. And then at that point, I give it over to my color, and the color caster. So I've given, like, the super basic, here's a statistic and here's vaguely what it means. The color caster can then give the context on, like, well, he's got this really high CSD because he plays Draven every game. And it turns out if you're playing Draven every game, you win lane every game, and therefore you have a good CSD, right? And these kinds of points that a lot of the audience don't really think about. And a lot of the time, statistics like this can be misused pretty massively. And that kind of context matters a lot. So a lot of it is working with your color to make sure that the statistics you're bringing up actually mean what you think that they mean. And there isn't extra context there that actually you're just saying something completely wrong. So but generally it'll be like introducing those topics and working with your color to set them up to talk about what they want to talk about as well.
Because that feels like a complete answer, right? I do like that you started talking about, you know, your first thing and your first go-to was storytelling. Straight away, like you mentioned, like that is, you know, kind of the baseline, the most important thing. And I agree, like everyone has a different answer on what it means to be a play-by-play. I think one of my favorite answers also in the past was, I think, Frostgurren, who said, you know, the play-by-play spikes, shoots the ball up or throws the ball up for the color caster to spike it down as well. Like that's part of the agreement, and that's more about the duo and how they interact with each other as well. But I do like that, you know, storyteller is the most logical answer here, because as a play-by-play, I think a lot of the time our role is, I wouldn't say underappreciated, but looked over as someone who simply just hypes up the games. And while that's true,
me shouty monkey,
me shout monkey. It's true, but it's also like there's more to it than that. And getting into this next question, I feel like we'll be able to alleviate on some of that, or show some of that as well. I wanted to talk to you about your theory, your prep for being a play-by-play, like what you actually go through, because I think this will also showcase what our role does in the back end that might not also be seen. What you personally as well, like I want how you prepare for your casts in LPL, like, you know, playoffs, like I mean, you cast finals for summer as well, which was a banger, by the way, an amazing cast. Like, you know, no, you're on this show, you're gonna get talked up. So tell me like regular season versus playoffs. Give me a rundown of what you specifically do to prep.
Sure. So obviously, if you couldn't tell by the first answer, big on the whole story thing, right? So my biggest kind of time sink and prep a lot of the time is going into player histories to look for like crossovers. So for example, like the easiest example, right, is Top Esports versus IG. Jackie Love won the world championship on IG in his rookie year. 2 years later, he leaves IG and joins this formidable Top Esports roster. So that was kind of like a big, especially last year, that was a big kind of story of not just Top Esports, but also of IG like trying to rebuild without Jackie Love, right? Because he was ultimately one of their core players. And he's one of those players that really changes the team that he's on. So trying to find things like that, because obviously that one's super obvious. Roster changes are always relatively obvious. But if you go back in the histories and things, like, for example, Knight and Yagao, like being from the same town, both playing in the same LAN cafe, being mid laners from the same area.
I love that narrative.
Both making it to finals in 2020. Like, trying to find articles and things like this. I have a few friends that I talk to try and find things from the Chinese side as well, because I think that's one of the things that's super underrepresented in the English broadcast of the LPL. Is like, most of us can't read any Mandarin, right? And ultimately, there is very little connection between LPL Chinese side in terms of the media there, in terms of like interviews that are going on, and like, you know, like for example, when Mad Lion's owner tweets, you know, fuck his players or whatever it was, it was like, we should bench
the owner, yeah.
Oh yeah, well, you know, the whole point, right? We know about that. We see all of that drama. We're like, we're neck deep in it instantly. Yep. Well, that shit happens over in China as well, but it's all on Weibo and it's all in Chinese, right? So it's very difficult for the Western audience to be able to get involved and see these stories and learn about these players' stories, right? And I'm not saying that I'm trying to bring drama to the cast, but I just mean, like, you know, there's a lot more than just owners shit talking players on Twitter, you know. And so, like, trying to find stuff like that, I dedicate quite a lot of time to, and I intend on dedicating even more time to this year, because I think that's the kind of stuff that can really add value to the cast that really no other region, aside from maybe Korea, but I feel like there's a much better window into the Korean scene for the Western fans. I feel like that's massively underserved in LPL. So that's a huge part of my prep. Obviously, there's also just like finding statistics. We have to create our segments every single week. So
that's another big part.
Putting a lot of thought into what are the overarching stories, not just for players, but of the teams for the week, so that we can build segments for that. Trying to think of creative ideas for segments, because I always find it really boring when the segment is just kind of like, you know, this team's good at this, B-roll, head-to-head. This team's good at this, B-roll, head-to-head. All right, into game. I find that monotonous. So I try and brainstorm ideas for that, which sometimes is really productive. Sometimes I feel like I've just completely wasted an hour because I don't have any good ideas.
Or eight of them, you know? Just saying.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, so yeah, just like finding statistics, finding B-roll and all that kind of stuff for our segments, finding story points, but then also a huge part of prep, I think, generally speaking, for most casters at a professional level, is like VOD review, looking over your own cast, looking over casts for colleagues as well, because like you and I have done some VOD review together.
We have
done some VOD review with many other casters. I think Medic is probably the one that I VOD review with the most. We try and do one every month if we can. And I think that is incredibly valuable, just to get an extra perspective on your cast, but also to look back over your casts, because if you always have moments in the cast that you thought were really good or you thought were really bad. So listening back to those again and seeing, actually as a listener, whether or not they were good is always incredibly useful. So I would say, yeah, VOD review is probably the second most time-consuming part.
Yeah,
because if you're doing it regularly, it does take a fucking long time.
And I think it's something that like both roles will people I've talked to will spend most of their time doing VOD reviews as well, right? People look at VOD reviews, and a lot of the time, if colorcasters are talking about them, they think it's just about the games and like the players. But something that I think is quite hidden is that we look over our own work quite a lot. Well, I mean, there's certain casters that do and don't. I mean, I was talking about Freak, talking with Freak on this a while back, I think a month ago now, and he told me, like, in general, he doesn't VOD review much, right? Whether I believe he's talking about himself as well, or over the players. I mean, he's been doing the craft for a lot longer than us. I think combined, because he started like in 2005 or something, or 6, like over Warcraft. So yeah, I think it's something that is really, really time consuming, especially when you want to get it right and down to pack. I want to come back and talk a little bit about your prep and your connection with the players as well, because I think that's something you've really enhanced, especially over this year as you've continued, learning LPL, this never-ending cycle with 17 teams, players coming from the LDL.
It's a lot of them.
It's a lot. And that's why it feels like some of them, like, weaving narratives in, especially when we're doing teams like Rogue Warriors, right? Rogue Warriors versus E-Star, or I don't know, like years past OMG, teams that sit at the bottom, like old Fiji. I think that's really hard, and it's something that, to give a connection to the audience, is something that I agree. Like, it's really time consuming, because you put so much effort in trying to be like, who is Vici Gaming J and why does he matter? And not all the time can you draw like a really good comparison. I think that's something that stumps you.
It's worth adding to that as well, that like, just because you spent 4 hours chasing a story and finding all this information does not make it interesting.
No.
You have to find a way to make that interesting, or worth your time. And quite often I found that I'll go out of my way to try and find a player story. It will take me ages to try and find anything. And then the interview that you do find eventually, that you have to like Google Translate and try and work out what they're saying. It's just another one of these Chinese players that basically says nothing in an interview. Like so many Chinese players, the interviews, they will be like, oh, what happened at this bottom lane dive? And they're like, oh, well, we dived them. It's like, wow, that's such great insight. Man, and you learn absolutely nothing. So there's a lot of wasted time in that stuff. But also, like, I know I've done it. Going onto the broadcast, you've got some shit that you found for yourself. You bring it up on broadcast, and it's kind of like, wow, now I say it out loud, that's really not that interesting.
Yeah.
Kind of wish I'd found a better way to approach that, honestly.
Or you can, again, there can always be too much, right? Like, I think you can also seek out player narratives or like stories that may have existed in the past, but you're presenting them now where it's a very either different player, they're in a different team environment as well. You can spin up stories that are not relevant and sell a player in. Selling them in a bad way is aside the point here, but selling them in a way that's different to what they are now. So I think also like getting the right information and not forcing it is a neat trick as well. Quickly before we move on to deeper into the discussion, you mentioned something that we talked about last part when we talked about us producing our own segments as well. And this is the other thing about the LPL broadcast and about what you do. And Lyric came into chat and talked about the 8-hour meetings, which is great. That's always good to see. But the making our segments as well, like it's a nice kind of two birds, one stone. Yes, that was correct. In the sense that it is part of the prep, right? It helps with things like narratives because you're creating your own segments and you have to find and source this information yourself. But I think it's also like, equally with finding player narratives, it takes a lot of time. Like it takes 3-4 hours, I'd say bare minimum. Okay, maybe a little less depending on the teams, to actually set up these segments and put put your prep into them because you have to, because we're producing them ourselves.
Yeah. And I will say it was a lot easier 2 years ago when Clement was on the team, because we'd go into a story meeting and he'd be like, hey, by the way, this happened.
Yeah.
We should talk about this. It's like, oh, brilliant. I'm so good at prepping these segments. Turns out.
Yeah.
Turns out Clement just knew a lot about the players. Yeah, so it can be a pain. So like, and Paulsable is saying it in chat as well. Like sometimes it's all of this stuff that you've prepped is just totally irrelevant to the game. Like I remember I was prepping for an RNG series, and I desperately wanted to talk about Gala. I wanted to talk about Gala's stats. I wanted to talk about how Gala is like this AD carry that nobody talks about, that like he's often forgotten because it's all the Xiaohu show, right?
Yeah.
We get into the game, and this is because they'd started playing around bot side a little bit, and we'd seen it a couple of games, right? It was like, oh, maybe this could be the perfect moment. Immediately straight back up to Xiaohu. We like the camera basically doesn't look at bot lane for the entire series. I'm like, God, fuck. I spent like hours getting all of this shit together. Like we don't even look at Gala the entire time. So yeah, that can happen definitely. But you know, that's just part of the job at the end of the day.
That's true. I mean, look, either way, like I think us and you especially, like I've seen you prep and I know how many hours you put in as well. So this really all lines up. Let's go to more of the practical side as well. We're still talking about the role and like what it is to be a play-by-play. Now, a lot of people out there will know that because we're talking the majority of the time, like overall, we're setting things up. We get to mid-late game. We are spruiking a hell of a lot and then shouting our lungs out. What do you do for your voice and like your warming up methods, your routines? Like give me a lowdown of how you would prepare your voice, or even some of the troubles you've had in trying to do so.
Yeah. So this is really bad. I basically haven't been doing any warm-ups this year at all, which unfortunately means that after the finals, my voice was really fucked to the point where for about a month, it was still kind of hurting a bit. If I was like shouting on stream or anything like that, my throat would start hurting again, which seems to have mostly gone away now. Praise that I haven't completely fucked my voice, but I am actually over the course of the next couple of months going to be getting some vocal training with a singing teacher to try and manage that, because the reason I hurt my voice on finals is because my biggest weakness as a caster has been like hitting that 10 out of 10 when the crazy shit happens, like matching that right vocally. And I still feel like I have work to do in that regard, but I feel like I did the best that I have in finals, but obviously hurt my throat in the act of doing so. So I clearly need to start doing some warm-ups, and I need to start actually using my voice correctly. So I've basically kind of I've been like the twisted fate of play-by-play shoutcasting, right? Because most mid laners have to get prio to be able to do things on the map. Twisted Fate, he cheats and he just fucks it anyway, right? So I did that with my play-by-play. I just fucking Destiny down bot. But the thing is, their jungler was Nocturne. He was on red buff, so he just flew in. I got fucked straight away. And so now I'm having to have singing lessons.
What is this analogy? This is like a B level analogy. Great.
So long story short, I haven't been doing any vocal warm-ups. Let me get back to you, because by the time we start next season, I will be doing vocal warm-ups.
All right. It's hard as well. Like we've been doing bedroom broadcasts for for the whole year essentially. I mean, to a degree for some of us.
Essentially, just the whole year,
yeah. So it's really hard as well, because you're not. It's easy in the studio because it's a routine, right? We'd get there at 2 p.m. We'd sit there and do like prep for an hour. We'd go and get makeup done. We'd get notes out. We'd have like the last hour or whatever. We could talk about it with our co-caster. I know Dagda would always start rapping or something, and an Irishman rapping American music was always funny for me. And like all those kind of things, better with a routine. It's hard as well. Like I reduced to only just singing like a song to kind of warm up, and I don't feel like I was properly warming up as well. So it's hard as well, because I think without music training, something that I still lack as well. Like I've done what you talked about. I went to a singing teacher for a couple of months, and I looked at like I think the proper word for it is diaphragmatic breathing, and how you get the voice into, you know, deep into that diaphragm, use it properly,
and build the habit of doing that as well. I
Yes.
think is the hardest part, right? Because anyone can watch YouTube videos and like you can teach yourself in theory. I have tried, I have failed. It's not something that comes naturally to me. So I think just getting help with knowing how to build that habit, and like you say, it gets a bit monotonous doing vocal exercises and things like this. So I think when you don't directly see the results every week, right? It can be difficult to keep the motivation to do that every single time.
It can be really demoralizing, yeah. So I think it's hard, and I think it's something that people, you know, it's something I've actually talked about earlier in the casting chamber when I did the first couple of episodes in Taiwan quarantine. And I remember the end saying, like, as well, like, if you want to, you know, work at this, go to a music teacher. 100%. They're perfect for things like this. If you're looking at, you know, being the best and you want to progress, like, it's a necessary expense in my mind as well. Yeah, towards the end as well, Munchie, I'm gonna there's a question in chat as well. We'll roll towards the end and we'll answer some of those as well at the end.
Yeah, no problem.
Joe, hold your.
I'm holding.
What do you hold?
My boobs usually.
Oh yeah. Okay. Well, glad this is progressing in such a great way. Hey, more on the practical stuff as well. We've already just talked about voice and how you warm up, how you go through your broadcast, how you kind of get things going. Just quickly, like, touch up on me, because I mentioned it before, what you were like in studio versus now. Like, we already talked about voice, but your process getting into a broadcast, starting from the point where you arrive at 2 p.m. China time, broadcast starts at 5. Fill in the gaps for me, whether it's studio mandated that you have to do, or, you know, you personally setting up.
Yeah, so I would get to the studio. I actually quite often went to the studio earlier.
You did?
Just because I find it very hard to work alone. Not even necessarily from home. It doesn't really matter where I am, but I'm definitely best working with other people because I get really easily distracted and I get really easily just off topic. So for me, being like, it's funny because I see all of these Reddit threads and stuff at the minute that are like, oh, we shouldn't have to go back to the office. Working from the office sucks. And like everyone just hates the idea of going back to the office after COVID and all this. I'm like, I want to go back to the office. Can I go to your office? Like, I just want to be near people.
Yeah.
Which I feel like I'm a puppy sometimes, honestly. But yeah, so I would go in quite often about midday or 1 o'clock, get some lunch on the way in. There was this really fucking good lunch place called Just a Bowl of Good Rice.
Oh, God.
God damn, I love that place. I desperately want to go back. And they would do like just this delicious pork on top of rice. And it was, you know, it did exactly what was on the tin. It was just a bowl of good rice.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm going a little bit off the topic
okay.
here. I'm just saying, if you're ever in Shanghai, just find Just a Bowl of Good Rice.
I feel like you right next to Shanghai for like this bloody not Suning anymore. Weibo now. I'm sorry.
Well,
Munchables.
It's probably not the same office, but the Suning office I hope still exists, and I hope Sword Art is still there for me to go and meet him. But he's probably not, since he's not on that team anymore.
I'm sorry, mate.
And that team doesn't exist. What was I saying? See, this is why I have to be in an office.
You like the idea of an office.
I like the idea of an office. So I would go into the office like midday, 1 o'clock. I would sit down, and what I would do is kind of like over the week or over, it was not usually a week because there was 4 of us. Over the time, over the days off, basically, I would put like statistics and things that I wanted to talk about onto a document. So I would go into the office and then I would essentially formalize that document. I had like a template that I would put, you know, all of the rosters on, any significant stories at the top of the document, some statistics I want to talk about, some narrative points, some, you know, like champion pools, these kinds of things. So spend like, I don't know, 30 minutes to an hour on that, depending on how big the series are, depending on what teams it is, depending on how much prep work I've done. And And also just generally hanging out with your co-caster, I think is invaluable. I think it's the most underrated like prep tool that casters have, is just building camaraderie and banter. Like, for example, when me and Lyric first started casting together, there was a Reddit comment that was literally just, I'm pretty sure these casters fucking hate each other.
I remember.
Because it was like we were trying to banter, but it was like kind of aggressive banter.
Yeah.
It was like very sort of English banter where you're sort of insulting to each other and you like sort of pseudo argue, and it did not come across on camera very well.
There's no.
But yeah, so just putting docs together, hanging out with your co-casters a bit, and then go to get makeup, which takes fucking ages.
It does.
Go put a shirt on and all of that. Go hang out with Bo or with Jinjin.
Yeah,
Jinjin is the coolest man I've ever met. Barely speaks a lick of English, but it doesn't matter because he's so cool that it's just like, even without being able to communicate, you can somehow emotionally communicate with this man. It's unbelievable.
For context,
he speaks a little bit of English, to be fair.
For context of people, Bo is not FPX Bo. Like, he's not doing the makeup. Like, that's not where he's been progressed.
This is Bowen. This is Bowen.
Yeah.
With it. I actually have no idea how you spell it. I assume Boen, but I could be totally wrong.
Boan is probably the.
Oh, maybe.
And yeah, definitely not.
But yeah,
definitely not FPX Bo.
Makeup, and hanging out with those guys.
Yeah,
and then go to the studio itself, because obviously this is all in the big office complex from TJ. We then go downstairs to the studio itself, do a quick rehearsal. In fact, we maybe even did rehearsal before makeup.
I think we usually did. It depends, because the Chinese. Another bit of context for people is the Chinese side usually got makeup first, I think. And so they'd be doing their casters, and then LCK casters, the Chinese LCK casters would be going first, and then the Chinese LPL casters would usually be around the same time. So we either got in early or had to wait for them. So yeah, usually rehearsal before, I think.
And sometimes you'd meet Teddy in the makeup room, and so you have to flame his predictions. That's kind of part of the rich. But yeah, no, then anyway, rehearsals, and then, kind of wait around until the show begins.
Yeah.
Talk about League of Legends.
Right. Simple. I think a lot of the stuff as well is just, a lot of studio stuff, LPL stuff as well. Like your own prep, I guess, comes before, and, that starting part where you talk with your co-casters, the main part as well. I remember having some great moments with Dagda singing like all the Irish songs, like Rattlin' Bog,
I sang the Rattlin' Bog a lot of times.
I love that, like half an hour too. Sometimes I'd be in like a crappy mood, I'd be in a really bad mood, and I'd not want to do it, and then he'd start singing it, and then I'm like there anyway. So a great way, like I love that kind of stuff, and especially like without shouting, like it was a great way to kind of get my vocals nice and hot. So that's great. So okay, voice warm-up, let's put that aside for the time being. I want to look more about like your long-term setup for casts and your revision as well. This is something I asked Freak as well, and I think it's important because we are I think in the past, like LPL's been very goal focused. I'm not sure how you treat this at the moment, but talk to me how you set up your goals and like how you monitor them, because I've talked about this a lot on Casting Chamber, on previous casting streams as well. I've talked about my document, my short, midterm, long term. But give me an insight as to how you approach your goals, or how maybe you do it differently or same.
Sure. So for me, I will typically try and have very few goals for a specific cast, right? So I'll build my goals in a VOD review. So either with someone or just by myself, go over the VOD. Ideally, you want to do this with the person that you cast with, obviously. Because a lot of it, like, you can like kind of say, oh well, I wanted to do more of this, but I couldn't do it because my co-caster was talking about this or whatever, right? When you're just on your own, where you don't have any extra context as to why they went they chose to go down that route instead, even if you talked about something else before the games or whatever. And you can end up essentially drawing to the conclusion of, well, there's nothing I could have done. Whereas if you're doing it with the co-caster, they can lend further context and you can decide together whether that was a good decision, whether it was a bad decision, whether you should have gone with what was planned, etc. It's always best to do this kind of thing as a team if you can. But also if you're just looking at mechanics, doing it by yourself is good too. But anyway, I'll try and pick apart a VOD as much as I can, and like kind of put down on paper what was good, what was bad, mostly what was bad, right? Because realistically, the whole point of this is to be critical. Find out all the ways in which I am shit, and then essentially prioritize that list of like, okay, what am I the most shit at? So there's this really good, I can't think of the actual quote itself, but there's a really good mentality idea from a book called The Mental Game of Poker, which I know doesn't sound relevant, but it's basically about how to, even though the basis of the book is in poker, realistically, the book is about how to improve your mindset and how to improve just in general at pretty much anything, and how to have the correct methodology to improve.
Okay.
And so one of the key things that I took away from this book is that the best way to improve consistency is not to try and build up your strengths. It's instead to try and work on your weaknesses, right? Because if you think about, this is the same for playing a game, this is the same for commentary. Honestly, commentary and playing are like, you know how players will just randomly have a few games where they just fucking into it and everyone's like, how can you be this bad all of a sudden, right? That happens with casting too. Sometimes you just suck. Sometimes it just happens and you just suck.
True.
The best thing that you could try and do is improve on that, because you essentially have a range that you're going to land in between. Let's say this is your 10 and this is your 1, right? Sometimes you're going to have a 2. But if you can improve on your core fundamental weaknesses, well, then you can reduce that range to between a 6 and a 10, right? And then once you've done that, then you can start to work on your strengths again, and you push your range further. And you can slowly but surely, it's called the inchworm, this method. And you slowly but surely inch this range higher and higher up the scale, so that your worst cast, after you've done this for a long enough time, is like 10 times better than your best cast could have been all that time ago.
Interesting.
So it's a really good way to build your consistency, but also to improve significantly over a long period of time. So sorry, just to loop around. That's why I prioritize this list on like, what is my biggest weakness? What is the gaping hole in this cast? And I'll try and set that as my priority goal for the next cast. I'll usually have a couple of smaller goals as well, but they'll generally be like one big goal that's like, I need to fix this. This is a problem. So I'll set that above everything else. Then I'll have a couple of smaller goals. So let's say it's team fighting power, right? Like hitting powerful moments in the team fights. Well, every single team fight that week, I'm going to be like, maybe even overselling it, maybe even overdoing it. If it's not that important of a game, I'll use that as essentially like sparring practice, right? Where I will really hit every single team fight, even if it's just a small skirmish. I'll be trying to hit the power. I'll be trying to hit the big moment, even if there's not that big of a moment, just to get the reps in on doing that. So I can then go back and look at that VOD and be like, okay, was I hitting the moment? Like, obviously I was going too far, but like, was I doing it well with my voice? Was I hitting the power, etc.? So that's the way I try and set my goals, because I find it much easier to improve if you're focusing on a specific thing. And obviously you can do minor improvements around that as well. But if you can focus your efforts onto that one big thing each week, I find that over the course of the year, you see much more. Like, I think I improved way more this year than I did last year. And this year I've been employing this method. So I'd recommend it personally.
I mean, that's interesting, because it's very adaptive to, like, because I mentioned at the start of the question, like, obviously how I do goal setting is different. Like, I do short-term, mid-term, long-term. And, you know, long-term will be things like hitting worlds, like trying to, you know, or hit an international event, right? Like, that's very career specific as well, not specific to technique. But short and mid-term is like, I'll have like a couple goals in each, looking at like, okay, short-term is what I'm going to try and do from the day-to-day. Mid-term is what I'm going to try and do like over the course of a month as well. And it's just interesting to see how different casters look at their approach to goals, because I think the way you do it is very, like concentrated on that next cast, you tick that away, and then you go back and VOD review the next week, and you look at like, oh, now I'm doing this, or I'm still doing this. I can keep working on this. So it's very, it's very like adaptive to what your cast's doing, and I think that's great.
So I just want to add as well. I also do like short term, long term, mid term, but generally that's more like much more vague than my cast specific. So like you're saying, long term is like make worlds and hit 1 million Twitter followers and become the most famous person on the planet. And,
holy moly!
Take over the world. These kinds of things.
Yeah, nice. Be in a Ryan Reynolds movie, that kind of thing. Be the next
Become
James
Stephen
Bond.
Fry's best friend.
Yes, become part of Hugh Laurie. The three of you are now a trio,
right?
So. Yeah, it's big goals.
The Mitchell, Webb, and Fenny look. I'm just saying, there's a ring to it. I'm just saying.
Open Joe's Pizzeria. The list goes on, and for goal setting as well, I think my biggest takeaway is if the one thing you and I both have in common, because there are a couple of things, right? Short term is still like, what we're talking about, and sort of the mid range as well, is not to overload it. I think a lot of new casters will be going through, and there's going to be a lot to critique. Amateur and semi-professional casters, even for people like us, and I'm sure people like Flowers or Medic, Quick Shot, like anyone, there's still probably a lot to critique when they're looking at themselves. But I think the key takeaway is not overloading your goal setting, starting with like some of the base fundamentals, if that's where you're at, looking at a couple at a time, or working at one big thing at a time, maybe two smaller things, rather than overloading yourself, right? That's a fair thing to say.
And I totally agree with that. And I think that, especially when you're starting out, it's very tempting to look at a VOD. Like I remember doing this when I was, casting university esports. I would look at one of my VODs and I'd be like, God, I'm so shit. And you essentially just watch like 5 minutes of the VOD, and like almost out of embarrassment, you close it.
Yep.
And like, it doesn't feel good to watch the VOD of you not being very good at what you want to be really good at, right? It doesn't feel good. But to quote Jake the dog, being really bad at something is the first step on the way to being kind of okay at something. All right.
Yeah.
So you got to get through that phase. And ultimately, if you can focus on what you think you're doing the worst, the thing that annoys you the most about that cast, the next time you're casting, focus on that thing.
Yeah.
And it'll feel like you're not doing enough work because you're only focusing on one thing at a time, but you will not fix everything at once.
Yep.
And by trying to focus on everything at once, you're going to just reduce your focus on each thing. And it's like jack of all trades, master of none, right? Try and focus on what you're sucking at right now, build that up, and that'll create a foundation for you to then improve your strengths. So, it's really, really worth VOD reviewing. It's really, really worth setting small goals off of that and then focusing in on the thing that you need to improve the most.
And also, like, that goal setting's fun when, not fun, but also it feels more impactful, as you talked about, talking about it with a duo caster, like talking about it with a color caster or a play-by-play, depending on what role you are. Going through that journey with someone else is always good, because especially someone who motivates you and pushes you to be like, okay, I'm going to be honest with you, that sucked, but here's how we can fix it, or here's what we can do to make us sound better, or you sound better. Duos are really important.
I've got a good example of this, actually, because me and Rob were doing a lot of duo VOD reviews this year together.
Yep.
And we were trying to set duo goals of like how we could work together better. So for an example of one was like setting each other up for cross map plays. So like constantly trying to be looking at the minimap. And so when there's like trades happening, one team is heralding on one side and the other team is got an Aphelios hitting the tower on the bottom side, right? And maybe there's a skirmish going on in the river at the same time. Trying to be aware that your co-caster also knows what's going on, right?
Yeah.
And so being able to not repeat each other and bounce off of each other in those high-paced situations and kind of like fastball it back and forth. Instead of just play-by-play monologuing for 3 minutes, it's like you're kind of really fast passing and it keeps the energy really high. So that was one of our goals across the course of this year, which I feel like we sort of hit, but I think there was a lot, still work to be done there. But we've also had arguments about certain situations where Rob had a personal goal that he wanted to like have moments in casts where it's like, here is what I have been prepping. Here's a super specific thing that I'm bringing to this cast. Here's like a bit of information that not many people know. But the problem was there was this cast where there's an Elder Dragon fight literally about to happen. We've got like maybe 10 seconds before this fight kicks off. And my personal goal, one of my personal goals, is get in and start ramping energy before the fight has begun. Right.
Yeah.
And the problem here is you end up with clashing goals. And it's something that you can, it's going to happen. You just have to work through that and figure out a way to fix that for next time as a duo. But that he was trying to have his moment of like, here's some goddamn researched information. Here's a golden nugget of beautifulness. And I'm like, Rob, shut the fuck up. Elder Dragon. And like there's this moment on the cast where I thought it was kind of funny, even in hindsight, to be honest.
Yeah.
He did not think it was so funny because I kind of cut him off and like super simplify what he's trying to say just to move it on so that I could set up.
Yeah.
So it was like, yeah, you know, in hindsight, it was a little bit awkward. We kind of debated how that works in future in a VOD review of that because I thought it was kind of funny. He was kind of annoyed by it. So it's one of those things. But yeah, so your goals can clash, but it's worth setting goals as a duo as well, because I think you can improve massively if you start thinking of this as a team game. You're only as good as your duo. You're only as good as your team. And that's not to say you have an excuse to be shit because you're with a shit caster. That's to say you got to bring that caster up and you got to work with them to make the cast as good as it can be.
That's right. Only as good as your duos are something I've heard many, many times and something that holds true. Moving forward, let's talk more about that broadcast and what you kind of provide. We talked about what a play-by-play is and like, you know, defining the role a little bit, looking at your voice, setting up. I want to talk more about what you think your duty is to an audience. And it's okay if this overlaps a little bit with what you define play-by-play, but what you feel like you should be delivering to the audience, right? Like if someone's watching you or watching a play-by-play in general, like what they should be getting out of you and what you feel like your duty is to the audience.
So I think, I mean, there's a lot of different ways that you could approach this question, right? I think on a fundamental level, you're essentially like the translator, right? Where a lot of the stuff happening in the game is not applicable to solo queue.
Yeah.
Like competitive League of Legends and solo queue are essentially different games at this point.
Absolutely.
I'm starting to get to a point where I think there are very few similarities between the real game and solo queue. So you're kind of a translator of what is happening here and why is it happening is the very basic answer. But to me, I think the duty of a commentator is to give the audience a reason to care. Like, why should you give a shit about what we're watching right now? Right? My job is to tell you that. I'm essentially a salesperson for these players, for these teams, for this league, and for the game itself.
Yeah.
And so this is why I have such a heavy focus on stories and on players specifically as well, because I have a personal sort of mantra. I think I mentioned the first mantra in the first episode, so this is the second mantra, and that's that people follow players, not sports, right?
True.
And so for me, my biggest responsibility is to try and give people an insight into who these players are, not just in terms of like how they are playing right now, but also in terms of their history and in terms of like maybe who they are as people, if there's something that's relevant and that we can bring into the commentary. And like, I think one of the best casters to look at, in fact, two of the best casters to look at in terms of this stuff were Monte Cristo and Papa Smithy. I think were fantastic at telling you a story of the history of these players and like digging into that a little bit more to build a connection between the audience and the players, because I think that's one of the things. I mean, look at Chovy, right? Chovy is a player that has been, reasonably speaking, unsuccessful. Like in the grand scheme of competitive sports, if you're not winning, you're not successful, right? That's just how it goes. Yeah. But as a player, his profile is huge, and obviously it helps that he's a fucking international superstar in terms of his talent. But the amount of backstory there is to Chovy, the amount of people that know about Chovy is thanks to people telling his story and spreading the word about how great this guy is and how good he is at League of Legends. So I think there's, and like Icon, for example, Icon this year, a lot of casters, you hear them talking about how it's his first ever Worlds after years and years of competing, right? This kind of stuff, I think, is invaluable. And anytime you can find those kind of bits of information, super, super valuable to a caster to have. Because I think when it comes to, like, let's say a team is about to be knocked out of the LPL, right? Not obviously there's no relegation, but only the top 10 teams make it to playoffs. If it's trying to think of teams in the LPL, like OMG became a team that people wanted to make playoffs because you got Cream, this fresh rookie that's got this incredible talent in the mid lane, plays Assassins. It's an exciting team to watch because they skirmish. Well, a lot of viewers, this is going to sound a little bit offensive, a lot of viewers can't tell the difference between teams. If you took the nameplates off, they wouldn't know which team was which, right? They don't really notice play styles. They just enjoy watching the game, and that's perfectly fine, right? But if you do a good job of building these teams and these players up, well, then the viewer has something to be excited about, something to look towards. Like, viewers know that OMG like to skirmish and that Cream always plays Assassins because every single OMG game we say, this is a team that likes to skirmish. Here are some statistics. This is a player that loves to play Assassins. His LeBlanc is insane. We want to see his Kiana, blah, 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 right? Like Teachamar, another player who, realistically, Teachamar is the best example I have of a player that is not actually that good at League of Legends in the grand scheme of professional players. Obviously, he's a lot better than I am.
He's stuck in like
no flame, Teachamar. If you're watching this, let's hang out. Let's get a pizza, dude. I love you. I'm serious though. Teachamar, if you look like, let's do a stream or something. But like, he's a player that had a super individual style, and even though he wasn't super good like Chovy or Cream or one of these players that, like Caps, for example, like of course he's going to get a big profile because he's an exceptional player. But because Teachamar had this style where he always wanted to play global picks, where he can go and influence the side lanes. It's like, this is the reason I fell in love with Morgan as well, because he was like, fuck the laning phase, I'm going to TP bot, and I'm going to get
level 3 Renekton or some shit, yeah, right?
Yeah, right? And that was exciting. And so trying to build those stories, this is the reason I love WE, because it's a different style. And like, it's my job to figure out these styles and these identities of the teams and put that across to the audience. Give them a reason to give a shit about the teams that are playing today. And I think that's the ultimate duty that we have as commentators, is to find those interesting and exciting stories and moments and sell those to the audience so that they can get invested in these teams and these leagues like we are.
And I think the one thing to pull out as well is, I know you talked about this in Level with Production, is that a lot of new commentators feel like they go beyond this and they think that their duty is to be, you know, funny. It's duty to be like, as a caster, to, you know, be wise or funny or witty or whatever, and they think more about themselves. And coming back to the point you made where you talked about it from a production standpoint, but I think all over, you know, the show comes first. Like, it is about the show. It is not about you. It starts with the players and then the teams, and then, you know, you can work your way out. And sure, it's like the quality of casting is important, but you as a caster, you're there to support the show. You're a piece of the show. You know, you don't come above. No one comes above the show, really. So just coming back to that point, it lines up with this.
Yeah, and I think that's something that is easy to forget as a commentator, right? Because ultimately you're in the spotlight. You're in front of the show, and you know, there's a long storied history of talent on shows, not just in esports, but in television in general, even just in showbiz, of you know, talent believing that they are bigger than the project, and that causing massive issues, right? I don't think that problem's ever going to go away. The ego is the enemy, as it were.
Yeah.
And I think that there's a lot of ego casting in esports because I think, right, we're at a weird impasse in esports. This is a bit of a tangent, if that's okay. But
no, go.
We're at this point in esports where a lot of people are hiring not because you're a good commentator, but because you are an influencer. And so we're sort of at an impasse where these companies that are hiring commentators need to decide what they actually want from their commentators, because there are commentators out there that are exceptionally good at their jobs. that are incredible commentators that will give you a really premium product. There are also commentators out there that not that they're not good at commentary, but that's not their focus. That's not the thing that they care about. They don't VOD review regularly. They don't care about improving as a commentator. What they care about is doing more content and doing more ways of engaging with the audience and becoming more of an influencer. And I'm not trying to belittle that choice, right? Because I do a lot of this stuff as well. It is important. Ultimately, it's kind of mandatory these days to do at least some of this. But the problem that I see, and this is something that I ran into because I did a bit of talent management when I was at ESL and at ESP, is that quite often like rates of pay in esports can be based on things like social reach, right?
They are majority fantastic. Of the time.
A lot of the time they are.
Yeah.
And not all the time, but a lot of the time. And I think that can be a huge problem, right? Because on the one hand, yes, if you're a small show, if your channel does not have a following, like, ultimately you're trying to hire influencers so people will watch your show, right? So, fair enough. You don't really want commentators. What you want is pull for your show.
Yep.
But if you're trying to if you already have the viewership, right? You want to hire proper commentators, but it's very difficult if you're in the production position, unless you have hours of time to just watch VODs of these commentators. Because, like, let me give you an example. Like, this happened to me at ESP. We're running white label productions. I don't know the commentators from World of Tanks, right? I don't even know World of Tanks. So how am I meant to discern which of these commentators is good in terms of analysis for World of Tanks? It's practically impossible for me unless I have someone to talk to. But even then, obviously, they're going to have inherent biases of who they recommend. They're just going to recommend their friends because that's how humans work. So it's a very, very difficult job of trying to establish who is actually good at their job versus who's just popular in the community, right? And I think that that's one of these weird conundrums that is going to start to sometimes affect the quality of broadcasts, because I think that we can end up in a situation where the people that are working on commentary as an art are kind of pushed to the side because they don't necessarily have the social following. They don't necessarily have the same like amount of Twitch subscribers, et cetera, et cetera. And so they're not going to get pulled on because they're not just saying the thing that will get KEKWs in Twitch chat, right? They're saying the thing that's important for building the stories. So I think it's going to be interesting to see over the next few years how commentary continues to change, because it's already becoming more and more important how much of an influencer you are and how much of a comedian you are and how much of just an entertainer you are, which makes sense, right? Because that's kind of how TV works as well. When you listen to sports commentary, we are entertainers. But usually there's a bit of a divide, right? Where the kind of entertainers are usually on the desk. They're usually the guys that are talking in halftime and you know, that kind of thing. When you listen to the actual comment, at least in England, when you listen to the commentary on a football game, there's very little personality. And it's intentional because the whole point is that, I mean, maybe this is British television, but I think the goal is to be as inoffensive as possible. Like try your best not to offend anyone. So you really don't have much room for personality in that scenario. But I am curious where we end up with that in esports, because I don't think it'll go that way. I think it will go the American route, and I think it'll become more and more important to be just a celebrity as opposed to a great commentator.
Yeah, because coming back to it, like the way I was always hired in Australia or whatever was, I don't know. I think about before I got LPL, and like as a contractor, I was picked up because I was doing a lot of commentary or I was working a lot with ESL. Like I, was becoming one of the top commentators in Oz. And I'm trying to think if my influence had anything to do with it. I'm thinking no, but I know that things like pay scale and like, your day rate is easy to leverage when you have influence, when you have social media following, when you have that influence you're talking about as well. I think a lot of the time it is based on that rather than, the experience, the time commentating, et cetera, et cetera.
And the funny thing to me as well is that, at the top end, I understand it. If I don't know, let's say I work for Monster and I'm trying to hire for some gig that I'm doing, right? Of course, I'm going to pay more money if you've got 500,000 Twitter followers.
Yeah.
Like, obviously, if you're getting the engagement, you're going to bring viewers. Fantastic. That's what I'm paying for.
Yeah.
The funny thing to me is that in like tier 3 Counter-Strike events, they'll change their pay based on whether or not you have 5,000 Twitter followers versus 4,000 Twitter followers. Motherfucker, neither of these guys is bringing viewership in. Like, unless you've got like almost 100,000 followers on Twitter, realistically,
you're not really bringing anyone. That's right.
Not mind blowing, right? You're not going to bring you unless you're a regular Twitch streamer or a YouTuber or something like this, where you actively bring viewers to a platform already. Like the transition there is not, or the can't think of the word, but you know, the link there is not as substantial as people seem to think that it is, and I think a lot of money is wasted in esports on completely inane statistics a lot of the time.
Yeah, agreed. And just a quick comment from Initialize in Twitch chat as well, talking about how rugby has a bit more personality in the commentary box. I agree. Australian rugby, I can agree on this as well. There is like a bit of personality in there, but yeah, it is focused on good game commentary rather than personality. I could even say like if esports goes that way, I think it's fine. Where I do like that in League of Legends, like people like, and this is not a throw to any other colors out there, people like Lyric and Cadril exist where sure they have good influence, but they're brought in, and I know this is like a tangent within a tangent. Okay, Cadril brings in a lot of viewers. Like he has a huge brand as well, but he's also been brought in because he knows a lot about the game as well. And I always love things like that because it's like you're bringing in people who are experts at their trade, which on the color side is knowing about the game, knowing about the small parts.
But I would tie that into what we were talking about before, where when you look at the way that those two guys commentate, ultimately they bring a similar level of analysis, right? In different ways as well. They have different strengths, but the way that Cadril talks to the audience is much more on that left-hand side I was talking about, where like he is ultimately a celebrity within esports. Yeah. And he'll say things that he knows are going to get Keck W's out of Twitch chat. He even has a Twitch emote of a Keck W tractor, right? Because that is his brand at this point, right? Hanging out with Twitch chat, watching the pros, et cetera, et cetera. Like he's built a huge brand around that. And so I'm not saying that that's a bad thing that he does that. What I'm saying is like when you listen to him cast and when you listen to Lyric cast, it's two totally different styles of commentary, despite the fact that they're both bringing really high level analysis and giving you a really good insight onto the game and to what the players would be thinking. And they've both been behind the scenes within teams, right? The way that they approach how to do that and the way that they inject humor into a cast, totally different from one another. So I think that's a really interesting comparison because you're right. They are very similar level knowledge-wise, but totally different approach commentary-wise.
True. And I love, bringing up the meme side as well, because I think on Cadril's side, he has really good balance. Not to say that Lyric doesn't either. I think Lyric, he's been casting for 2 years and coming from a coach side. Has it been 2 years yet? It's,
well, he came a little late in year one, but let's be honest, that was a power year.
That was.
I'd say that counts as a year and a half.
Yeah, true. All in one with 6 days a week of LPL or 7. I can't remember. That was wild. Moving on as well, because I've got a couple more about this as well, about how our role kind of lines up. I want to look more about what you do for your color caster, because you just told me your duty to the audience, and we went off and talked about what's kind of happening with broadcasters and commentators, because that duty to the audience I think is being skewed by employers a little bit, because they're not looking at at hard commentators. But going even further than that, I want you to talk to me about your duty or your role to your color caster this time, and how you'd kind of describe that partnership in your cast. Because you, out of let's be quite real, you and Dagda in 2020, you lived together through all that, and you guys cast a hell of a lot together. You've done it in 2021 as well. You've developed a very good duo. So I think this question to you is going to be quite revealing as well into what you think your duty is to your color caster.
So there's an extent to which your duty is always going to be don't fuck them over, right? Yeah. I think there was a really great example of this in the most recent World Series, where it was Dracos, Cadriel, and Kobe. And Kobe says, oh yeah, they can let, it's Dragon number 3, it's Cloud Drake. They're like, they can let the enemy team take this Drake to cycle it so they can go for a better soul. And Cadriel and Dracos are like, do we say anything? Nah, let's just play it cool. And then a minute later, Kobe goes, I'm a fucking idiot.
Yeah.
You can't cycle Drakes. What am I saying? That was a long time ago. and they all have a laugh about it and move on. But the key thing that I want to highlight there is that even though that's a really egregious mistake and clearly, obviously wrong, like, they don't go out of their way to be like, Kobe, you're a fucking idiot, right? And I think that just having your duos back is important. And if it's something that's like really egregious, maybe it's worth just going, yeah, and on the other side of that could be like this as well, and like trying to offer it as an alternative opinion as opposed to just correcting someone. Like, you always want to have your co-casters back because ultimately it's a team game. You want to be working as a team, and if you do that kind of thing often, like, it's gonna grate on the general relationship within the cast as well. Like, if you're being kind of a dick to your co-caster, they're not gonna want to cast with you. It's gonna lose the fun out of the cast. Like, there's a lot of extra factors there, I think. But on top of that as well, like, I think what Froscorian said to you before is very poignant here, in that, like, as a play-by-play, a lot of the time I'll be messaging Lyric or Dagda before I cast saying like, hey, what do you want me to set you up for? What can I do for you? And whether it's talking about, so one of the examples of me and Rob, when we were improving our cast this year, one of our big working points was trying to improve early game structure.
Yeah.
So I would go out of my way in the early game to go to Rob and be like, talk to me about jungle pathing, talk to me about lane priorities, talk to me about what team fights are going to look like in the late game, talk to me about who's going to win in the mid game, et cetera, right? So that we could get all of that stuff out of the way and have a bit more freedom in the conversation later on. But Rob wanted to nail that shit early, so that we could then take the conversation where we wanted and kind of have that foundation to work off of. So it's about talking to your color caster and knowing what their strengths are. Like, for example, I don't know, Lyric, I'm sorry if you don't want me to tell everyone this, but I'm going to tell everyone this.
Do it anyway.
Lyric's the kind of color caster that doesn't really want to talk about bot lane. Not that he can't talk about bot lane, but he's not really interested in bot lane. He wants to talk about mid laners. He wants to talk about junglers. He wants to talk about top laners. So as and when we're in a cast together, unless it's a bot lane focused game, unless it's a series where it's like clearly the bot lane is going to be everything, I will always talk about mid laners or junglers or top laners. I will always try and set up the top side of the map for Lyric because that's what he's interested in. And ultimately, the conversation and therefore the cast is going to be way better if we're talking about stuff that he actually wants to talk about. Otherwise, it's just an interview, right? Like, if I'm just asking questions that my color caster doesn't want to answer, it's essentially an interview, right? And that's not how you get a conversation started. So I think just finding out what they're good at, what their strengths are, what their weaknesses are, and trying to play towards that, trying to set them up to shine. If you can make everyone else on the show look good, you're going to look good by default. So
that's true.
I think that's the best way to approach it, and I would say that's your biggest responsibility to your co-caster.
And I'd also say, like, there's been casters historically who've done this really well. I think I always go back, and Munch, you're a good example of this, actually. I think your line in history is a very good example of setting your colors up to be the best they can be. And also because you have a bit more game knowledge than the average play-by-play, I feel like you utilize that well, and you don't take their points, but rather you can set up like better direction if you want to go deeper in a point, or if you want to go towards something else that you know they're comfortable with. I go back in time and I think of casters like Quickshot, right? Where I think historically, Quickshot has been the best one in doing this. This is my opinion, and why I looked at him so much, because Deficio was knowledgeable as a caster, but I don't think he would have sounded anywhere near as good as he sounded in the end if he didn't have someone like Quickshot to set him up and know those interests and look at his strengths and really push them to an audience. I think he did that really well with Crepo in the past as well, when Quickshot and Crepo worked together too. making them sound better than they already sound, right? I think there's specific casters that do it quite well.
Yeah, I mean, Quickshot is the guy that I've watched probably the most VODs of. He has been the caster that I've tried to build my commentary around. So that's kind of funny that you make that comparison, because that is literally the guy I've been trying to emulate. And I totally agree that it's all about that setup, and it's all about like it's not just like when you listen to Quickshot casting and he asks a pretty niche question about something. I know it sounds really off the cuff and like he's, you know, curious about this. Probably spoke to his commentator before that cast and they wanted to talk about this topic. And he's incredibly good at finding ways to very smoothly segue the conversation into that topic. And that's one of the things I'm trying to work on, is like how smoothly I can position the conversation into a topic, because there's an art to that. Like the reason that when commentators get criticized for like narratives and stuff like this, often it's because it was shoehorned. They just went, all right, narrative one.
Yeah.
There is an art to being able to gradually bring a conversation around to the point that you want to make. And I think Quickshot is the best in the business of that.
Yeah. Knowing when your color commentator on that note as well, like, will give you that room. I think that's something you worked really well with Dagda, where, you know, you don't need to shoehorn, it just slides in, because you know, Dagda a lot of the time will bring up narrative points as well, like quite slyly, where you can expand on it, or vice versa, where he's happy to do so. With Lyric, quite a lot, I noticed like it was Giga game related, and I actually had to pull back and find some narrative because I had none at all. We were so game related. It was like, because I was just like, this guy knows so much about the game. Let's keep talking about comps, dude. This trade mid, like, is it meant to go that way? Oh, not. Oh, we've seen this before. Oh, you know, I mean, you go deeper and deeper. So there's always a balance, but talking to your co-caster is a big takeaway from that as well. And I like that you've kind of perfectly defined what your role is to your color caster, because at the end of the day, as a play-by-play, you're part of that partnership, but you're also, a lot of the time, you know, they lean on you a bit. As a play-by-play, you get lent on by your color, and I think that's perfectly natural. You can also lean on your color in a similar regard, where for information for flow too.
And also just like I was saying, you got to have each other's backs, right? Sometimes your brain goes blank. Sometimes you just don't have anything to say. Sometimes someone brings up a topic of conversation. I mean, this is outside of casting as well. Sometimes someone brings up a topic of conversation. You just don't have anything to say about that, right? It happens. And like sometimes I'll bring up a dud question or whatever. Like, you got to be there to have your co-casters back. Like, on the opposite side of that question you asked me, of like, what's the responsibility? Well, for colors, sometimes your play-by-play is going to be the monkey brain play-by-play that you know him to be. He's going to say something stupid, or he's going to ask a dumb question or whatever. You kind of have to entertain that to some extent. And maybe, like, you know, Lyric, maybe you're not interested in bot lane, but god damn it, it's Huanfeng versus Jackulov, and I'll be damned if I'm not talking about this bot lane matchup, you know? And sometimes you do just have to go down the rabbit hole a little bit with your co-caster. And that's, and if, you know, that's part of the beauty of it. That's part of the beauty of the relationship.
And if you don't know something as well, you could, like, I've been even more forward with my cast, and I'd be like, you know, I actually don't know about that. Like, I'll say it on broadcast or whatever, because sometimes it's nice to be honest. And I also think about, I don't know if you've seen IT Crowd, and I think of Douglas, and there's a scene in it where, if people haven't seen, you know, he shoots himself in the leg, he goes to the meeting, and the feeds get crossed, and there's like a tradesman like peeing in a bathtub instead of like the Asian businessman they were meant to be talking to, and they're all watching it. The feed cuts, and he stops, he goes, lots to think about there, you know. It's just like, I think like sometimes when the color cast is talking, and I go, because Lyric goes some crazy place, and I'm like, yeah, lots to think about there. Like, I don't know what's going on. It happens.
Yeah, it really does. Yeah. And I think also, just a random slight aside of like, just I don't know if like this is winding up and I can just go on tangents, but like, if you are a caster, if you are trying to get better as a caster, you want to know the number one thing that all casters fucking suck at? Just listening to the other dude on the commentary. So often I listen to casters, especially at an amateur level, and people are just waiting for their turn to talk because they've chosen to get into commentary. So the odds are they love the sound of their own voice, right? I don't know a single commentator that doesn't like talking, right? Obviously.
Yeah.
And that's not an insult. Like, that probably means that you're the kind of personality that is going to work as a commentator. But god damn it, you need to have a conversation with your co-caster.
You do.
If they're talking about, like, it's like you're saying, sometimes Lyric will go on a big thing about something, or Dagda will go off and down a rabbit hole of talking about the minutiae of a matchup. Like, one of the things I pride myself on as a commentator is following what they're talking about and being able to ask either a follow-up question or add a little bit of insight myself, right? And like, make that a conversation instead of just letting it sit and then transition away. Because I think that is the crux of these like shoehorn transitions that we've been talking about all episode, right? Is when you haven't listened to what they were saying and you've just got your next point ready. And sometimes you do need to do that. Sometimes there's a graphic that production is going to bring in. Sometimes there's a sponsor segment, whatever, right? But generally speaking, if you can follow on, even if you're going to segue, at least be like, yeah, man, that Ezreal's E, right? God, the interactions on that, they're limitless. Go check out Vanderil's YouTube channel. You'll see thousands of them. Speaking of Ezreal, on the other side of the bottom lane, let's talk about Jackie, though. Or, whatever it is, right? There are ways to transition away from a conversation while still acknowledging that the conversation has happened and adding something to that conversation. Because otherwise, it just feels so robotic. And that's where your energy just dies. It's like those little gaps of you just waiting to speak instead of listening to your co-commentator. It's like a little vacuum, and all of the energy just pours itself into that little vacuum.
Because I feel like I'm definitely someone who, I'm not sure if I'm the most in the team, but I feel like I'm someone in the past and even now who active listening like can sometimes be really hard for me. You definitely do it the best. Lyrics just said all three of us are now listening. So,
I would say that's one of my big weaknesses as well, to be honest. I just can't concentrate for long enough.
Yeah, it's
They
hard.
won't stop talking, man.
But extracting information out of what they're saying and like finding the interest is a big thing. And I think there are degrees of it, right? Where like we'll drop the ball like every now and then, or I'll talk personally, like I'll lose a sentence here and there, but the majority of the time, I feel like with my better cast, I am actively listening. But you're right, amateur cast as well. It's like it's always about whose turn it is to speak, and I think that's something that anyone who is starting out in casting, like if you get that down, if you get that conversation down, and part of it's building rapport and knowing what they want to speak about, like we've already gone through. But if you're listening and you're having that conversation, you are better than 90% of other amateur casters already. Like it is something that is so undervalued as a skill, and people just want to hear people having a good time and chatting and about their favorite game, right? Or about one of their favorite games. And in that sense as well, it's like you show that you're interested not only in the game, but the players who are playing it on screen as well, and in the show itself. So another part of not being above the broadcast.
If there's three things that I would say you need to nail as an amateur caster, here are the three things.
Okay.
First off, active listening and just being able to have a conversation with your co-caster is absolutely crucial, as Jake's just saying. Second thing, pop the fuck off. Don't sound like you're in your parents' upstairs bedroom. Even if you are, don't let the audience know that.
Yeah.
Just pop the fuck off like you're in a stadium. Because when shit's going down, you got to be excited. Because if you're not excited, the audience ain't excited. And then the final thing is just have fun. I know that sounds really cliche, but so many commentators sound like a deer in headlights. Just enjoy yourself.
Yeah.
Vibe with it, Have a good conversation with your co-caster. Set them up as much as you can. Pop off when you need to. You're going to have a great cast.
True. I like the simple. Thank you for rounding that up. I've got a couple of questions that I want to end with before we close this one out. Because I feel like this has been like really educational, and there's a lot of good takeaways here for even semi-professional casters, and for myself as well. Before I ask these questions, I just want to say that like you never stop learning as a caster. That's one thing that like you're never perfect. It doesn't matter if you're even someone like Flowers. Like I know like the work he puts in consistently, and I'm sure that guy's like level of prep, his development is always there. Because it doesn't matter if you're the best or, you're up there or you're a Premier League caster. You can always get better. You can always develop. And as soon as you stagnate, The audience will notice. Of course, you'll notice. Your co-casters will notice, and it's disingenuous to your craft. So you can always develop, and you should never be thinking that you can just get by lulling. So.
Yeah, and it sucks to listen to commentators that you know are better than they are commentating, because it's very relatable. Like, we've all had, like I was saying before, you can be inconsistent as a commentator just like you can as a player. And it sucks listening to someone when you know that they can do much better. And sometimes it's not that they're not putting the work in. Sometimes it's just not happening right now.
Yeah.
But sometimes you know it's because they're not putting the work in. And sometimes you know that they're just being a bit lazy. And it's just like, bro, come on. We can all see a mile away. Like, it's not as sneaky as you think it is. It's when you've watched enough commentary, you notice flaws in absolutely everyone's casts if you're looking for them.
That's right. You can pull them apart. Right. Question time. So Jared earlier on, who's been in the chat for quite a bit, asked this question. He was talking about remote broadcasts and you know, when we were talking about 2020, we were remote for the whole year. Lyric and I were traveling between Hong Kong and Taiwan. I actually think that that was 2020 in China. 2021 was also fully remote. Where that's when we were between Hong Kong and Taiwan, and was one of the worst splits for me personally as well. Speaking on the remote broadcast, what positive effects do you think there have been? The increased number of people across different countries of casters has certainly been cool for different perspectives. Because looking at this straight away, positive effects for remote broadcasts, I would say for me, have been very slim. I don't look at many positives, and that's the truth. Like, I love studio casting. I love the energy. I love being in an arena. Remote has been, I guess, I don't know. Have you had any positive effects from it? Family?
Not really. I mean, I'm in Europe, which is nice. I get occasional freelance gigs while I'm in Europe, so that's great. But I would have been in Europe for the off season anyway, so that's not really changed much. Like, being in a studio is just infinitely better. Like, I guess one of the side effects is I've bought a banger PC setup, which isn't really. I mean, it's because of remote casting, but it's also just because I wanted to buy it. Really, let's be honest. But yeah, I don't know. Like, casting at home, it's very, very difficult to build the same energy that you can in a studio. Like,
it is.
Trying to communicate with your co-caster in a cast while you're not next to each other is fucking impossible, man.
Yeah.
Like, that's one of the big things that I'm going to try and work on for next year is, like, we need to figure out a system that you know, whatever. We'll get to that, but yeah, I don't know. Remote casting kind of fucking sucks, I'll be honest. But being in Europe is nice, at least being in the UK. Means I get to see my dog, which is very nice. I get to hang out with my family. I get my meals cooked for me, which is real nice. But yeah, generally speaking, the positives of remote casting are few and far between.
Yeah, I think it's, you know, being with family and for me, being back in Australia where I'm not, you know, country hopping and having visa problems, and that was very stressful, and it did affect my cast in 2021 spring. Like, I felt like I had the worst split I've ever had, and it was really rough. But and Lifey came in and said that the only upside is you get more gigs you can do without traveling. And for me, like, if I was still, I guess, available in Australia at the time, it would have been there. But doing LPL 7 days a week, at least until the season ends and the contract ends, like, I can't really do that anyway. But
it's really hard to do any freelance. Like, I've been able to do a tiny bit, but it's like, it needs to be like maybe a 1 day event. And even then, you have to ask them to, like, rearrange the schedule for you, and it's a bit of a nightmare. And
it's also like COVID still exists, so at least here in Australia, like, a lot of events are either not running or then they're being done from home broadcasts anyway, and it's quite difficult. Lifey also asks, what would you say is the optimal way of going about selling yourself? I see that people have a highlight reel and others just drop a full cast VOD. Well, Munchables, this is definitely easy to start on.
Yeah, so I can't remember if I said this in the last episode or if I'm thinking of a different conversation, but I'll just reiterate in case. I've worked as a producer. I mentioned on this episode, like, I was trying to find World of Tanks casters. Like, it's fucking impossible.
I cast that, by the way.
There's a high likelihood that the producer of the show that you're applying for does not know League of Legends super well. Unless they're working in LEC or LCS or something, they probably don't produce League of Legends very regularly, unless you're lucky. So sending them a full VOD, they're not going to watch 45 minutes.
I fucking hate that.
They don't have time for that shit, man. Like, even if you want to send them something from a VOD, at least send a clip of, like, the team fight that you cast. Or, like, here's a bit where I went really in depth. But generally speaking, a showreel is always going to be better. Try and keep it high energy. Try and, like, make it so that they want to watch the video. Make it as entertaining as you can of a video. And that's going to do all kinds of favors for you. You can get creative with it as well. It doesn't just have to be like, here are clips of me commentating. Like, if you've done content outside of that, include that kind of thing. You could even do it like, you know how there's like these video CVs where someone presents their shit and it's like really cringy? Well, you could do some kind of meme on that where you present each clip. That might be a terrible idea, but, like, you know, get creative with the way that you're approaching doing a show, really. It doesn't have to just be boring. And the less boring it is, probably better, within reason. It still needs to be functional. But yeah, the best way to sell yourself is honestly just be honest. Actually assess what you are good at. Like, if you don't know what you're good at or what you're bad at, nobody knows what you're good at and what you're bad at. Like, most people will not know what you're good at and bad at. And even the people on Reddit who think that they know what you're good at and bad at are probably wrong. So make sure that you've assessed your strengths and weaknesses so that you can talk in depth about that stuff. Because, like, let's say you get in a call and they're like, why should I hire you? Well, maybe you only have 200 followers on Twitter, so that's not a very good argument. You don't have a YouTube following, you don't have a Twitch following, so, okay, why should he hire you? You need to know the answer to that question. And the best way to get an answer for that is to know what you're good at, what you're going to bring to that broadcast that nobody else brings. So I would say those are the two big things.
I'll also say, like, coming back to full cast VOD, don't ever do that. I'm going to be more hard. Like, I've said this in previous episodes of the Casting Chamber. I've said this to people who've DM'd me in Twitter, because recently, as you guys know, LPL's gone out and put a post out on Twitter saying they're looking for casters for the future. If you send someone a full VOD, whether they're a producer or even another caster, like, let's say for a VOD review, right? I will go back and, like, I won't look at it. Maybe I'll look at a bit of it, but it's not fair on anyone's time to send them a full VOD, a 2-3 hour VOD of casting.
Yeah.
And for
especially
them to sit
if they
there.
don't know you. Like, if I don't know you, why should I watch 3 hours of your
That's right.
casting? Right? Like, think about it from the other person's perspective. They have a life too. And it's not that they're being a dick necessarily. Like, but if you can say, hey, can you watch this team fight and give me feedback on that? Absolutely. That's 2 minutes of my time. No worries.
Give it time,
That's just
like,
me doing you a favor.
Yeah.
But, like, if you send me an hour-long video and go, hey, watch this and tell me all of my problems, you watch it and tell you all your problems.
That's
you do
right.
a VOD review. Like, you're asking too much, especially if you don't know them. If you know them, it's a different story, right? Depends on your relationship. But, like, out of the blue, I'm not gonna watch it hour-long VOD for you, bro. Like, I'm sorry.
And it's fine, like, sending a full VOD. Maybe if you're applying for something, and coming back to the question of Lythy saying selling yourself is completely different to, you know, looking for feedback, of course. If you're selling yourself, I would always recommend a highlight reel. I did one for the LPL application in late 2018. Put together something that shows different skills. Munchables talking about before, be unique, right? Like, do you do hosting? Do you do content? Don't give me all the same shouting. I got a DM recently where it's like all the same. It sounds exactly the same for 5 minutes of a highlight reel. And I go, well, where's the variety? Where's the change? Show that you're adaptable. Show that you're showing me, sure, your best skill, but you need more than that. So, coming back to
the whole package.
You do. And if, like, I would never recommend, if you're applying for something, giving a VOD link, and even if it's a timed VOD link. I think VOD links are only okay when, one, they've got a time code and as Munchables said, asking for specific advice, and two, looking like at doing a VOD review. You know, that's completely it. I think highlight reel for sure. That's the best way to sell yourself. As Munchable said, be honest with it as well. I couldn't agree more.
Yeah, be honest and just tell them actually who you are and why they should hire you. And if you know the answers to those questions, then maybe that's good enough. And maybe it's not, because maybe they've got medic also applying, right? You never know who else is applying for the job. And also, I'm going to be totally honest, the best caster does not always get the gig. Not how it works. So sometimes it does just suck. But if you're honest and you tell them what you're good at and you actually know what you're good at, then that'll get you gigs.
And I think as well, like if you apply for something and people go, well, this person's good, but we're going to hire this other person. Remember that when they come back around, they'll go like, remember last time we had this applicant? Like we've done that before. You know, I without naming any names, like there is a couple of people in the LPL team who have come back around interviews who now work on the product. I'm not going to name, people can guess, whatever. And it wasn't that they were bad casters at the time. There was just someone more suitable. And we've come back around a year later and it's been like, hey, you know, they're good for the team now. And they've gotten work. So being memorable as well with not only your interview, but with like something like a highlight reel has multiple uses. Not if you don't get the job the first time, it could still happen again, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. It's about being persistent, right? And consistently staying at it, because you're not going to get every gig. It's as simple as that. And like,
that's right.
I was trying to get on a major region for 6 years, I think, before I got onto a major region. So
yeah.
It's about persistence at the end of the day. Even if you look like this, you can make it.
Oh wow! So if you guys aren't as attractive as Munchables, I'm so sorry.
Yeah. This is par. Like nose like this, there's only so much you can do.
Just shitting on yourself, God. You know, on that note as well, like I remember 2015 to 2019. I mean, I tried to get into OPL. I never got OPL. And I got LPL before I got the major broadcast in Oceania. So being persistent and trying to impress and go through that. Munch, that's it. We've gone through questions. Thank you for coming back. And actually,
thanks for having me back.
Hey, we now have 4 hours of Munchables content in total. So not a bad way to go. Give us a plug. Tell us what you're doing in the future, like whether you're doing more bevies or any more content. Give us a bit of a plug and tell us what's next, especially in the off season, because we have, holy shit, we actually only have like 2 months until LPL starts. Technically 2 months and a bit. That's stupid.
It's crazy. It's crazy.
Stupid.
Yeah. So 2 months of off season ahead of us. I will be doing some content on my Twitch and on my YouTube channel, so go subscribe on both. Don't just follow the Twitch, subscribe to it, tier 3 or else. So I'll be doing some single player games and stuff like that. I'm going to be trying to do some LPL content as well, so I'm planning on doing a video where we talk about potential roster moves that we think could happen for the next year. And so I'll try and think of some more LPL based content ideas that you guys can watch. But other than that, I'm gonna be chilling. I'm gonna be going on holiday, so that'll be fun.
Nice.
You guys won't be a part of that, unfortunately, but I don't know yet, because it might be Las Vegas, but the American border isn't currently open, and on the 8th of November we find out if it's going to open up. So I'll let you know.
I feel like have you had AstraZeneca?
No, I had
Pfizer.
Pfizer.
Yeah, nice. Yeah, if you've had AstraZeneca, you can't go, at least from Australia, you can't go into America. So yeah, it's kind of wild.
Imagine being a cringe AstraZeneca kid.
Oh.
Imagine not being part of the P gang, you know?
Okay, well,
cringe.
Well, anyway, before we get into vaccines and everything, links are in the chat there as well. Thank you everyone
for having Moderna.
Yes. Links are in the chat for Munchables. There's his Twitch, there's his Twitter as well. Thank you everyone for joining in, for any of the subs, follows, etc., etc. Go follow Munchables there in the links as well. Thank you again for giving me another part to this and talking very much about play-by-play. I feel like this is a really valuable resource for people to look onto. We'll be back. We're going to end stream here, guys. Thank you again. We give claps to Munchables. We thank him. And we'll be back.
I just want to say as well, thank you, Jake, for creating this awesome series, because I think it's super valuable for especially amateur casters that are trying to get into the scene, but also casters that are just trying to improve. I think getting different insights from different casters is incredibly valuable. So fucking double thumbs up from me. Good shit, dude.
It's a pleasure. I feel like there's a lack of resources out there for growing casters, and I kind of it bothered me a lot. Also for grassroots, for players as well, I will say there's a big space there that needs to be filled too, and I don't know how I do that one, so we'll see how we go. Thank you again, guys. We're going to end the stream here, and Casting Chamber will be back another time with someone else as well. Thank you again. Bye-bye.